The heavy iron door of the foundry didn't just close, it sealed like a tomb. Sherry Corley stood in the center of a space that felt less like an office and more like a fortress of rusted steel and cold concrete. There were no glass walls here, only the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar empire built on sweat and silence. At the far end of the loft, silhouetted against a grid of soot-stained factory windows, stood Roy Lynch. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. The power in the room flowed toward him like a tide. "They say every person has a price, Sherry," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that echoed off the exposed brick. "And looking at your bank statements, I'd say yours is quite low." He finally turned, his eyes as cold as the iron beams above them. With a flick of his wrist, he slid a slip of paper onto a heavy, reclaimed oak table. It was a check for $1 million. For a mother whose daughter's heart was failing and whose eviction notice was already taped to her door, that piece of paper looked like a miracle. "Take it," Roy commanded, his tone devoid of empathy. "Save your daughter. Buy the life you were never supposed to have." Sherry's hand trembled as she reached for the lifeline. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, the scent of fresh ink and salvation. But before she could grasp it, Roy's hand slammed down on top of the check, pinning it to the wood. The air in the loft turned ice cold. Before we go further, please take a second to subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. "But there is a condition," he whispered, leaning in until Sherry could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. "The shipyard, 10 years ago. You sign a non-disclosure agreement stating you saw nothing, you leave the state tonight, and you never, ever tell your daughter who I really am." Sherry looked into the eyes of the millionaire who had ruined her past and was now trying to buy her future. The $1 million was a gift, but the condition was a cage. She had 60 seconds to decide: save her daughter's life or bury the truth forever. 3 hours earlier, Sherry had stood outside the towering brick facade of Lynch Industries, clutching a crumpled letter in her fist. The building loomed over the industrial district like a monument to ambition, a converted ironworks that still bore the scars of its former life. Rust streaks ran down the exterior walls like old wounds that refused to heal. The windows were tall and narrow, barred with thick iron frames that made the place look more like a prison than a corporate headquarters. Sherry's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from the hospital. "Maya's oxygen levels dropping. Need decision on procedure by Friday." Friday was 2 days away. The specialized heart surgery her daughter needed cost $847,000, a number so impossibly large it might as well have been $1 billion. Insurance had denied the claim 3 times. The hospital's financial aid office had stopped returning her calls. She'd sold everything she owned, maxed out credit cards she'd never be able to pay back, and still come up $830,000 short. She pushed through the heavy steel door. Inside, the reception area was sparse and industrial. Exposed ductwork ran across the ceiling. The floor was polished concrete, cold and unforgiving. A security guard behind a metal desk looked up, his face expressionless. "Sherry Corley?" She nodded. "4th floor, elevators at the end." He pressed a button under his desk, and a freight elevator groaned to life somewhere in the building's depths. The elevator was a cage, literally. Old iron bars surrounded the platform, and it moved with the slow, mechanical grind of industrial machinery. As it rose, Sherry caught glimpses of each floor through the bars. The second floor was filled with drafting tables and computer stations. The third floor had conference rooms with walls made of reclaimed ship timbers. But the fourth floor was different. The doors opened directly into a vast open loft that stretched the entire length of the building. And there, at the far end, stood Roy Lynch. Roy didn't turn when the elevator doors opened. He stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the city through those massive windows. The afternoon sun cut through the glass in harsh, angular shafts, illuminating dust motes that drifted like ash through the air. The space around him was deliberately sparse. A few pieces of heavy furniture, all dark wood and industrial metal. Everything built to last, everything designed to intimidate. "I know why you're here, Sherry," Roy said without turning. His voice carried easily across the empty space, resonating against the brick walls. Sherry's blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone about Maya's condition except the hospital staff. "How do you—" "I make it my business to know things." Roy finally turned, and for the first time in 10 years, Sherry saw his face clearly. He'd aged, but wealth had been kind to him. Silver touched his temples now, and expensive clothes hung perfectly on his frame. But his eyes were the same, calculating, empty, the eyes of a man who saw people as numbers on a balance sheet. He walked slowly toward the massive reclaimed wood table that served as his desk. His footsteps echoed in the vast space. When he reached the table, he picked up a piece of paper, a check, pre-signed, the amount line filled with precise mechanical lettering. He held it up so Sherry could see the number. $1 million. $1 million, Roy said, placing the check on the table with deliberate care. Enough to pay for Maya's surgery, with money left over to relocate, start fresh somewhere, give her the childhood she deserves. Sherry couldn't breathe. The numbers seemed to glow on the paper, pulling at her like gravity. $1 million. The solution to every problem that had kept her awake for months. Maya's surgery, the back rent, the collection notices, the crushing, suffocating weight of impossible debt. All of it erased with a single signature. "Why?" The word came out as a whisper. "Why would you give me this?" Roy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because I can. Because your suffering means nothing to me either way. And because, Sherry, I need something from you in return." The temperature in the loft seemed to drop 10 degrees. "There's always a catch with men like you," Sherry said, her voice steadier now. "So what is it? What do you want?" Roy walked to a leather chair and sat down slowly, studying her like a specimen under glass. "Do you remember the shipyard, 10 years ago? The night of the accident?" Sherry's heart stuttered. The shipyard, of course. It always came back to the shipyard. The silence in the loft stretched thin and dangerous. Outside, the city hummed with afternoon traffic, but inside the converted foundry, the only sound was Sherry's ragged breathing and the distant groan of machinery from the floors below. "I remember," Sherry said finally. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I remember everything about that night." Roy leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Then you remember that I wasn't there. You remember that I had nothing to do with what happened to those workers." "That's not what I remember." Roy's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something sharp and predatory. Memory is a funny thing, Sherry. Unreliable, especially when you're young, scared, working a night shift in a place you barely understood. He stood and walked back to the table, his hand hovering over the check. This money can change your life, can save your daughter. All you have to do is sign a document stating that you saw nothing unusual the night of the shipyard accident. You leave the state tonight. I have a plane waiting at the private airfield. And you never speak to the press, never speak to investigators, and never tell Maya who I really am. The words hit Sherry like physical blows. Who you really are? Roy's smile was cruel. Did you really think it was a coincidence that I reached out to you, that I just happened to know about Maya's condition? He pulled a folder from a drawer in the desk and slid it across to her. Inside were hospital records, birth certificates, photographs, and there, at the bottom, a DNA test result with 2 names, Maya Corley and Roy Lynch. The room spun. Sherry gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. That's impossible. We never.
The night of the company party, 10 years ago. You were 23. I was married, ambitious, about to close the deal that would make Lynch Industries what it is today. Roy's voice was clinical, detached. You don't remember because I made sure you wouldn't. A little something in your drink, nothing harmful, just enough to make the evening blur. Nausea rose in Sherry's throat. The gaps in her memory from that night, the confusion she'd felt waking up in her apartment with no clear recollection of how she got there, the pregnancy test 3 weeks later that had changed everything. It all suddenly made horrible, crystalline sense. "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm a pragmatist. And right now, pragmatism means protecting my reputation and my company. The shipyard accident is being reopened. New investigation, new investigators who can't be bought as easily as the old ones. Your name is on the witness list. If you testify, if you tell them what you saw, it could cost me everything. But if you sign this NDA, take this money and disappear, Maya lives, you live comfortably, and I continue building the empire I've worked for."
Sherry's mind reeled backward, pulled into memories she'd spent 10 years trying to bury. The shipyard had been her first real job after dropping out of community college. Night shift security, minimum wage, but it was something. She'd walked the perimeter of the facility, checking doors, logging truck deliveries, staying invisible. The night of the accident, she'd been making her rounds when she heard the shouting. It came from the main assembly building where the night crew was working on a rush order. She'd approached cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Through the grimy windows, she'd seen them. Roy Lynch, younger then but still as cold, arguing with the foreman. Even through the glass, she could see the fury on the foreman's face as he pointed to the scaffolding, to the workers suspended 40 feet above the concrete floor. Remembered Roy's response, his hand slicing through the air in a dismissive gesture. The foreman had grabbed Roy's arm. Roy had shaken him off and turned to leave. And then the foreman had climbed the scaffolding himself, shouting down to the workers to stop, to get down before. The sound of metal tearing had been deafening. The scaffolding had collapsed, sending 6 men plummeting to the factory floor. Sherry had stood frozen behind the window, watching in horror as bodies hit concrete, as the night filled with screaming. She'd seen Roy Lynch stop at the door of the building, turn back to look at the carnage, and then walk away into the darkness.
The official report had called it equipment failure, faulty welds, no one to blame. The workers' families had received modest settlements, enough to keep them quiet, not enough to live on. The foreman had survived, but suffered brain damage so severe he couldn't remember his own name, let alone what had happened that night. And Sherry, terrified and pregnant and desperately in need of the paycheck, had stayed silent when the investigators came. She'd told herself she didn't see enough, that she couldn't be sure, that her testimony wouldn't matter anyway. But she knew the truth. Roy Lynch had ordered those men to keep working on faulty equipment because stopping would have cost him a contract worth millions. And when the scaffolding fell, he'd walked away and let them bleed. "I was a coward," Sherry said, her voice hollow. She looked up at Roy, who watched her with the detached interest of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. "I should have spoken up, should have told the truth." "And what would that have accomplished?" Sherry asked. "You think your word would have mattered against mine? You were nobody, Sherry. You still are. The only difference is that now I'm offering you the chance to become somebody, somebody with enough money to matter."
Sherry's hand shook as she stared at the check. $1 million. She thought of Maya in her hospital bed, pale and small, oxygen tubes in her nose, asking her mom when she could go home. She thought of the doctors explaining with professional sympathy that without the surgery, Maya had maybe 6 months. Maybe. How long do I have to decide? Roy glanced at his watch, a sleek piece of Swiss engineering that probably cost more than Sherry's car. "You have until I lose patience. Given that the investigation hearing is next week, I'd say you have about 60 seconds before I withdraw the offer entirely." "And if I refuse?" Roy's expression hardened. "Then you leave here with nothing. Maya stays on the general surgery waiting list, which, as you know, is a 2-year wait she doesn't have. The eviction notice on your appointment goes through, and I make one phone call to the hospital administrator, who happens to be a golf partner of mine, ensuring that any charitable aid applications you've submitted get lost in the bureaucracy." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I can make your life infinitely worse, Sherry. This offer is the only lifeline you're going to get." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He'd engineered the entire situation, from Maya's conception to this moment, to give himself maximum leverage. Every thread of Sherry's life had been in his hands all along, and she'd never even known it. "Why tell me she's yours?" Sherry asked suddenly. "Why not just buy my silence about the shipyard? Why tell me you're Maya's father?" For the first time, something like discomfort crossed Roy's face. "Because you're a mother," he said flatly. "Mothers are unpredictable. They do irrational things for their children. I needed you to understand that taking this money means protecting Maya from ever knowing her father is the man who let 6 workers die to protect a profit margin. That's a burden I'm willing to place on you to ensure your silence." The words were calculated to wound, and they succeeded. Sherry felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. "You've thought of everything," she said. "I always do." Roy pushed the check closer to her. "Sign the NDA, take the money, save your daughter. That's all that matters." But even as he said it, Sherry felt something shift inside her. For 10 years, she'd lived with the guilt of her silence. She'd watched the news coverage of the families broken by the shipyard accident, had seen the memorial erected outside the facility with 6 names engraved in stone. She told herself that speaking up now wouldn't bring those men back, wouldn't undo the damage. But standing here, faced with Roy's casual cruelty and absolute certainty that she'd take his blood money, Sherry realized something fundamental. Staying silent hadn't protected her daughter. It had only given Roy Lynch the power to hold both their lives hostage. If you believe that truth and justice are worth more than any amount of money, hit that subscribe button. People like Roy Lynch won't, and you need to hear what she did about it.
"Before I decide," Sherry said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I need to tell you something about that night at the shipyard." Roy's eyes narrowed. "I know what happened that night. I was there." "That's right, you were." Sherry reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She turned the phone toward him. On the screen was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. It showed Roy Lynch standing in the doorway of the assembly building, illuminated by the security lights, looking back at the fallen scaffolding and the bodies on the floor. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m., the night of the accident. The metadata was intact. The image was irrefutable. Roy's face went white. "Where did you get that?" Sherry said, "I took it." Her voice was calm now, all trace of trembling gone. "The security company issued us these old phones with cameras for logging incidents. I'd forgotten I had it until 3 months ago when I was going through old boxes looking for anything I could sell to raise money for Maya. I found the phone, dead battery, cracked screen, but when I charged it, there it was, you walking away from 6 dying men."
Roy stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "That proves nothing. I could have been there for any reason." "Maybe. But combined with my testimony that I heard you arguing with the foreman, that I saw you order the men to keep working, it's enough to reopen the investigation. Enough to raise questions about the original findings. Enough to get journalists interested." Sherry pocketed the phone. "I've made copies, sent them to a lawyer, with instructions to release them to the press if anything happens to me." The power dynamic in the room shifted like tectonic plates. Roy Lynch, who'd entered this conversation holding all the cards, suddenly found himself across the table from a woman with a weapon he couldn't buy, intimidate, or silence. "What do you want?" Roy's voice was hard as iron. "I want my daughter to live, but not like this, not built on blood money and buried truth." "Then she dies." Roy's words were vicious. "Because without my money, you have nothing. That photo might damage me, but it won't get Maya her surgery. You'll expose me, ruin my reputation, and still watch your daughter, our daughter, die in a hospital bed because you couldn't swallow your pride."
The sun had moved while they'd been talking. The light through the factory windows shifted, casting long shadows across the loft. In the dimness, Roy Lynch looked older, smaller somehow. A man built of ambition and cruelty, facing the prospect of consequences for the first time in his life. "You really think the truth matters more than Maya's life?" Roy asked. His voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that might have been genuine confusion. "You'd really let your daughter die to punish me?" "No," Sherry said. "I'd let my daughter know that her mother stood for something, that truth and justice aren't just words people say, they're values worth sacrificing for." She stepped closer to the table, her eyes locked on his. "You spent your whole life believing everyone has a price, that every person can be bought if you just offer enough money. But you miscalculated with me, Roy, because my price isn't money. It's my daughter knowing she had a mother with integrity. Integrity doesn't pay for heart surgery." "No, but the truth does." Sherry pulled a folder from her bag, thin, worn at the edges, but clearly important. She placed it on the table next to the $1 million check. "After I found the photo, I did some digging, called some of the families from the accident, found out that you didn't just cut corners on the scaffolding, you'd systematically defrauded the safety inspection process for 3 years,
bribing inspectors, falsifying documents. I have statements from 2 former employees willing to testify. I have forged inspection reports with your signature on them." Roy's carefully constructed mask finally cracked. "Those documents are worthless. My lawyers will bury you in motions for years. You'll spend every penny you have fighting litigation you can't win." "Maybe. Probably." Sherry nodded. "But whistleblower protections are getting stronger. And the families of those 6 workers, they've been waiting 10 years for justice. If this goes public, and it will, you won't just lose money in lawsuits. You'll lose contracts. Investors will pull out. Your empire will crumble one brick at a time." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, a train whistle echoed in the distance. Inside the foundry, 2 people stood on opposite sides of a table, one holding a check for $1 million, the other holding the evidence to destroy him. "What do you want, Sherry?" Roy asked again, and this time there was no arrogance in his voice, only cold calculation. "I want you to confess publicly to the investigators reopening the case. I want you to admit you ordered those men to work on faulty equipment. I want you to establish a fund for the families, not a settlement, a real fund that will support them for life." She paused. "And I want you to pay for Maya's surgery, not as hush money, as restitution for the daughter you created and abandoned." "That's impossible. If I confess—" "You'll face consequences, maybe criminal charges, definitely civil suits. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your company might not survive." Sherry's voice was steady, implacable. "But 6 families might finally get justice, and Maya will live knowing her father did one decent thing in his life." Roy Lynch looked at the check on the table, then at the folder of evidence, then back at Sherry. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and picked up the check. Sherry's heart lurched. Was he going to tear it up, increase the offer? But instead, he held it out to her. "Take it," he said quietly. "Take the money. I'll confess, I'll establish the fund. But you take this check, you save Maya, and you disappear. You don't testify at the hearing. You don't talk to the press. You let the investigation run its course, but you stay out of it." Sherry stared at the check, suspended between them like a bridge across an impossible divide. It would be so easy. Take the money, save her daughter, let someone else carry the burden of justice. The families would still get their fund. Roy would still face consequences, and Maya would live. But even as she reached for it, Sherry realized the trap. Without her testimony, without the photo and documents as evidence entered through a witness, Roy's lawyers would shred the case. The confession would be coerced, inadmissible. The fund would evaporate in legal maneuvering, and in the end, Roy Lynch would walk away with his empire intact, and 6 families would still be waiting for justice that never came. "No," Sherry said, pulling her hand back. "I don't want your money, Roy. I never did." She reached out and, with one deliberate motion, tore the check in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed in the vast space. Roy's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and finally, something that might have been fear. "You just killed your daughter," he hissed. "No, you did. 10 years ago when you made the choices that put us both in this room." Sherry gathered her folder of evidence and tucked it back in her bag. "I'm testifying at the hearing next week. I'm releasing the photo to the investigators and the press, and I'm going to make sure every person in this city knows exactly what kind of man built Lynch Industries." "You'll get nothing," Roy was shouting now, his composure completely shattered. "No money for Maya, no surgery, nothing. You think your self-righteousness will comfort you when she's dead." Sherry turned toward the elevator, then paused and looked back. "Maya's not going to die, because I'm not the only one who cares about justice, Roy. Turns out, when you spend 10 years connecting with the families of the men you killed, when you share evidence and build trust, people want to help." She pulled out a phone and showed him a screenshot. "Crowdfunding campaign. Started yesterday. Already at $400,000. The hospital has agreed to start the procedure once we hit $600,000. We'll be there by tomorrow." Roy stared at the screen, comprehension dawning. "You never needed my money." "No. I needed to look you in the eye and tell you that you don't get to win. Not this time." Sherry pressed the button for the elevator. The old freight cage groaned to life. "Enjoy the empire while it lasts, Roy. It was built on bodies and silence. I'm about to bring it all down." The elevator arrived. Sherry stepped inside, and as the doors began to close, she saw Roy Lynch, millionaire, CEO, architect of an empire built on other people's suffering, collapse into his chair, staring at the torn pieces of a check that represented the last time he'd believed his money could buy anything. 6 months later, Sherry stood outside the old Lynch Industries foundry. The building looked different now, scaffolding wrapped around the exterior, crews working to transform it from a monument to industrial ambition into something else entirely. The city had seized the property after Roy Lynch's confession and conviction. The criminal charges had been extensive: involuntary manslaughter, fraud, bribery. He'd gotten 15 years, though he'd probably served less with good behavior and expensive lawyers chipping away at the sentence. But the building wouldn't stay empty. The families of the 6 workers, boasted by the restitution fund and the sale of Lynch's assets, had purchased the foundry with the intention of converting it into a community center, a place for job training, education, support services for working families who'd been exploited by people like Roy Lynch. Sherry had been asked to serve on the board. She'd accepted. "Mom, come on, we're going to be late." Maya's voice rang out clear and strong. She stood near the entrance, bouncing on her toes, full of the irrepressible energy of a healthy 7-year-old. The surgery had been a success. The crowdfunding campaign had exceeded all expectations, ultimately raising $1.2 million. The excess had gone to other families struggling with medical debt, a ripple effect of generosity that Roy Lynch, with all his money and power, could never have created. Sherry walked toward her daughter, toward the building that once represented everything wrong with unchecked ambition and the exploitation of the vulnerable. Soon, it would represent something different: the possibility of redemption, the power of community, the simple truth that standing up to bullies and monsters wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Inside, the foundry's vast interior space was already being transformed. The industrial equipment had been removed, replaced by construction materials and the framework of what would become classrooms, meeting spaces, a cafeteria. The families of the lost workers had each helped design some aspect of the center. One room would bear each man's name, not as victims, but as the people they'd been: fathers, sons, brothers, skilled workers who deserved better. At the dedication ceremony, one of the widows, a woman named Elena, whose husband had fallen from the scaffolding 40 feet onto concrete, approached Sherry. "You gave us this," Elena said, gesturing at the space around them. "Not just the money, the truth, the acknowledgement that they mattered." "I just told the truth," Sherry said. "You all did the hard work of turning it into something meaningful." "That's not how we see it." Elena squeezed her hand. "You had a choice: save your daughter or do the right thing.
Somehow, you figured out how to do both. After the ceremony, Sherry and Maya walked together through the foundry. Maya asked about the building's history, about why her mom had chosen to be involved with this project. Sherry had already decided to tell her daughter the truth, age-appropriate but honest. Maya deserved to know that her father had been a flawed man who'd made terrible choices, and that her mother had been brave enough to stand against him.
"So, the bad man who owned this place, he's in jail now?" Maya asked. "Yes, sweetheart." "Good." Maya looked up at the high ceilings, at the light streaming through the factory windows. "I like that we're making it into something good. Like we're taking something broken and fixing it." Sherry smiled. "That's exactly what we're doing." They stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The city sprawled around them, flawed, complicated, full of people struggling to survive in systems designed to exploit them. But also full of people like Elena and the other families, like the donors who'd contributed to Maya's surgery fund, like the activists and lawyers who'd helped build the case against Roy Lynch. A year ago, Sherry had walked into this building desperate and powerless, facing a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. She'd left with nothing but evidence and conviction, having rejected $1 million because some things, truth, justice, dignity, couldn't be bought. She'd gambled everything on the belief that there were still people in the world who cared about doing the right thing. She'd been terrified she was wrong. Turned out, she'd been right all along. As they walked away from the foundry, Maya slipped her small hand into Sherry's. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Sherry looked down at her daughter, alive, healthy, full of questions about the world and her place in it. "Yes, baby, we're going to be just fine." And for the first time in 10 years, she believed it. Behind them, the foundry stood solid and enduring, ready to become a monument not to one man's greed, but to the resilience of ordinary people who refused to stay silent, who chose truth over comfort, and believed that justice, though delayed, was always worth fighting for. The heavy iron door that had once sealed like a tomb now stood open, welcoming anyone who needed refuge, support, or simply a reminder that the powerful could be held accountable. Roy Lynch had built an empire on the belief that everyone had a price. Sherry Corley had torn it down by proving he was wrong.